There was a long table in the center of the house, always set, always waiting. Plates arranged with deliberate symmetry, forks and knives aligned as if preparing for a moment that would never come. The chairs, each pulled back just slightly, gave the illusion that someone had just stood up, or might sit down at any moment. A roast cooled untouched at the center, its aroma now only a faint trace in the air. Bread hardened in the basket. Fruit darkened in the bowl. Nothing molded, but everything aged. The room around it had grown still, in a way that felt rehearsed. Curtains half drawn, letting in a gentle spill of morning light that never moved beyond the edge of the table. Dust floated but never settled. The chandelier above, unlit but ever present, dangled like a question no one wanted to answer. On the sideboard, a clock ticked with a certainty that felt mocking. It ticked for a room where time should have stopped long ago. No one dared clear the table. It became part of the architecture. Visitors whispered in the hallway, lowering their voices as they passed by, as if the table might overhear them. The family, if it could still be called that, moved around it. They passed through the kitchen without lifting the lids on the pots, without glancing at the dishes lined neatly by the sink. When hunger came, they ate elsewhere, knees drawn up on armchairs, standing by the window, leaning against door frames. Never here. There was a time when that table promised warmth. It had been carved from a tree in the valley where laughter echoed between hills. Every groove, every knot in the wood held stories of shared meals, spilled wine, quiet forgiveness. That memory still lived in the grain, though it had no voice to protest its silence now. Instead, it wore the silence like a shroud, as if mourning not a person, but a moment that never arrived. The table waited still. Each morning, light crossed it. Each night, shadows reclaimed it, and through it all it held the weight of what might have been, a gathering that was prepared for, dreamed of, even prayed over, but never lived. Sometimes in the quietest hours, the air around the table would shift, almost imperceptibly. The linen napkins would flutter slightly, though no windows were open. A spoon would tilt against the rim of a bowl, as if nudged by an invisible hand reconsidering whether to eat. These movements weren't enough to call haunting, but they unsettled, not with fear, but with memory, the kind that doesn't rise sharply, but pools quietly beneath thought, waiting. On one such morning, a child wandered into the room, barefoot, with a crumb trail marking where he had come from. He stopped at the edge of the table, eyes wide, not with confusion, but with the instinctive reverence children seem to have for the things adults never explain. He reached for an apple, the brightest thing in the room, but pulled his hand back before touching it, as if warned by something older than speech. Then he sat on the floor, not at the table, and began humming to himself. Not a song, just a rhythm that didn't match anything in the room, and after a while he left. The apple remained. The chairs, though empty, were worn in the shape of people who used to sit there. One still leaned slightly forward, where a father once rested elbows to tell the same stories every night. Another bore the soft fading of a child's foot swinging endlessly beneath it. A third had a faint scratch on the arm, where a wedding ring had rubbed over the years as a woman sliced bread, even while talking of other things. There was no need to imagine them. The table remembered, and so did the light. It never hit the same place twice in quite the same way, yet somehow always caught the glint of a glass, the edge of a fork, the gold thread in a placemat. These details shimmered like hopes once spoken aloud, plans made, guests invited, meals prepared. But somewhere, perhaps in the narrow space between intention and event, something had shifted. Something had gone missing. Not a person, but a presence, the kind that pulls everyone to the same place at the same time and makes them stay. Now, all that remained was stillness. A banquet without a moment, a feast without voices. The table stood, not forgotten, but unfinished. The house itself adjusted around the table, as if in agreement with its vigil. The floorboards creaked more softly in this room, as though stepping lightly out of respect. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. No decorations had changed in years. Paintings that once stirred conversation now merely filled space, their colors fading into the background like stories nobody told anymore. A vase of dried flowers sat near the far edge of the table, not replaced, not removed, just there, as if to say something once bloomed and that should be enough. There were days when someone would pause at the doorway, sometimes with a dish in their hand, sometimes with nothing but a sigh. They would stand there, halfway in, halfway out, staring at the place where they once belonged. You could tell by the way their eyes moved across the table that they were counting, not plates or utensils, but absences, counting how many times they had meant to come back and didn't, how many things they wanted to say but never did. Eventually, they would turn away, every time, because some meals asked too much to be eaten. There was no dust on the plates. That was the strangest part. Everything else in the house aged, mirrors blurred, wood dulled, air thickened, but the table remained untouched. Not clean, not shining, just preserved, like something waiting to be resumed, like someone had simply stepped out for a moment and would return with wine, or bread or laughter. But no one did, and so the table waited, not knowing whether it was sacred or abandoned. Sometimes, in that silence, you could hear the memory of silverware being placed down, the soft hush of a napkin being unfolded. A chair scraped just slightly, then settled. You could almost hear the anticipation of a first bite, the breath before the toast, but nothing followed. It was not a haunting. It was not even grief. It was something quieter, a kind of pause that had forgotten what it was pausing for. And in that pause, the room became something else, not a dining room, but a monument. Not to joy, not to tragedy, but to the weight of moments that never arrived. A temple for the almost. Outside, the seasons changed with indifferent rhythm. Spring brought the scent of wet earth through the cracked window pane, and autumn whispered dry leaves across the doorstep. Snow once rested quietly on the windowsill, casting soft light into the room, but it never stirred the table. The weather came and went like old friends who no longer knocked, still familiar, but not expected. Nothing reached the center of that table, not even time. There was once a photograph on the wall nearby, but it had tilted just slightly over the years. No one fixed it. In the picture, people smiled, genuine, full, unaware. Their bodies leaned toward one another in that instinctive closeness families forget to notice while it's still theirs. One could almost believe the meal had happened after the photo, that the table had been used, that the laughter in the frame had echoed off these very walls. But the truth was quieter. That photograph was taken just before everything began to drift. No one remembered the exact moment the table stopped serving meals. There was no declared ending, just a gradual unraveling, a trip postponed, a conversation avoided, a chair left empty for just one night, and then another. Slowly, meals moved elsewhere. Lives adjusted to new rhythms. People ate from their laps in front of televisions or at separate hours. But the table remained set, as if someone, somewhere, still believed. And maybe someone did. Maybe there was still a trace of hope caught between the fibers of the placemats, folded carefully under the weight of routine. Maybe someone kept the table prepared not out of stubbornness, but mercy. A belief that one day the chairs would be filled again, that forks would lift and hands would reach and words would flow, that hunger, the kind that food alone can't soothe, would finally be met. But hope, like bread, grows stale in stillness, and yet no one threw it out. Once a guest did arrive, uninvited, though not unwelcome. An old friend of the family, perhaps, or someone whose name no longer lived on anyone's tongue but lingered in the air like a melody hummed too often to be forgotten. She stepped into the room as if she'd never left it, and stood by the table without speaking. Her fingers hovered above a glass, not touching, just remembering what it felt like to raise it in laughter. Her eyes scanned the place settings, and something in her expression softened, not with grief, but with recognition. She didn't ask why the table was still laid. She simply nodded once, and left a jar of marmalade on the corner. No one moved it. It sat there like an offering, the lid sealed, label worn, contents turning to gold in the light. It didn't spoil. It didn't belong. And yet it made sense. More than the empty chairs did. As though someone had finally responded to the invitation, but knew better than to sit down. The table, it seemed, could accept the presence of a gesture more easily than the presence of a person. After that, others followed. Not many. A neighbor who dropped off a fresh loaf, still warm in its paper wrap. A distant cousin who placed a single letter beneath a plate, sealed with care, unread. An elderly man who stopped at the window each Thursday, never entering, just watching. These were not acts of habit or duty. They were acknowledgments, subtle ways of saying, "We remember too." Still, no meal was shared. The plates gathered symbols rather than crumbs. The silverware caught reflections instead of hands, and the table began to resemble less a place of gathering and more a stage after the actors had bowed and the curtains refused to fall. Everything remained in place, but the story had concluded somewhere off-scene, long before the first course. And yet, the table endured, not as an object of use, but of meaning. Not for what it held, but for what it withheld. It asked nothing, demanded nothing, but it held space, not just on the floorboards, but in memory, in hesitation, in the shape of days that kept moving around it, a full table and no meal. In the evenings, when the rest of the house faded into lamps and silence, the table remained lit by the last strand of dusk. Not by design, it just happened that way, as if the sky itself hadn't given up on the room. The softest shadows stretched across the plates, touched the rim of each glass, and then slipped away without a sound. It was in those fading moments that the table looked most alive, not with presence, but with waiting. Sometimes someone would pass the doorway and pause, as always. But sometimes they would linger. One might rest their hand on the back of a chair, not sitting, just touching, as if to remind themselves that they still could. Others might whisper a name into the room, not loudly, not even consciously, a name that belonged to someone who used to laugh with their mouth open and drop their napkin at least once every meal. And the table, unmoved, held it all. Every name, every silence, every absence. The house grew older. Walls shifted slightly in the seasons. Paint peeled. The upstairs bathroom faucet began its soft, nightly drip. Yet the table stayed untouched. No one dusted it, but it never grew dull. No one added a place setting, but none went missing. There was an unspoken agreement. The table would stay as it was, for as long as it needed to. Like a question no one could answer, but no one was ready to stop asking. And one day, the roast was gone. Not replaced, not thrown out, just gone. No one remembered removing it. No one claimed to have touched a thing. But the plate remained clean, polished, dry, as if time had finally lifted one small weight and carried it gently away. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a release. The kind that happens when you stop waiting, not because you've given up, but because something inside you has finally arrived at peace. That night, the chandelier above the table flickered once. Just once, as if bowing. And the next morning, the chairs were still there. The plates, the glasses, the marmalade, all waiting. But somehow, the room felt lighter, as though the meal that never happened had finally been eaten, not with mouths, but with memory. A feast of what could have been, swallowed quietly by the passing days and digested into the silence. The table didn't mourn, it simply remained. There was a cabinet in the far corner of the dining room, tall, narrow, with glass doors that revealed the good china, the kind only brought out for guests who never came. The plates were trimmed in fading gold, the cups delicate enough to tremble when a drawer closed too hard across the house. No fingerprints marked the glass, only reflections. Each shelf held more than porcelain. It held echoes, pieces of a past that had expected to become tradition, but somehow remained rehearsal. Behind the cabinet door there was a bowl, blue-edged, shallow, with a fine crack down one side that had never quite reached the base. It was the serving bowl she had once favored, the one she believed made even boiled carrots look elegant. Someone had tried to mend it. There was a faint seam of golden resin along the fracture, now hardened into permanence. But it hadn't been used since. It just rested there, facing forward, as if presenting itself to time for safekeeping. The light in the cabinet shifted throughout the day. Morning brought a cool glow, making the china look almost untouched. Afternoon cast a warmer haze, and the fine dust caught in the golden trim began to resemble ash. By night, the cabinet disappeared into shadow, its contents remembered more than seen. And yet, it always felt like it was watching, not ominously, but gently, like a witness who promised to forget nothing. No one opened that cabinet anymore. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even when someone died. But still, the dishes remained prepared, cups nested, saucers aligned, as if every item inside believed that someday someone would open the doors, lay out the plates, and finally use them. Not out of duty, not out of mourning, but simply because it was time. Sometimes the youngest daughter would pass by the cabinet and pause, fingers brushing the wood but never pulling the handle. She wasn't truly young anymore, just younger than the ones who used to gather around the table. Her hair had begun to silver at the edges, and the weight in her shoulders no longer came from youth, but from carrying memories that had no place to land. She would tilt her head, almost hearing the clink of plates being stacked, the rustle of napkins folded with care, but she would never open it. Perhaps she feared the sound it might make. The creak of glass, the shift of porcelain, might break something delicate in herself. Once, she brought a guest into the house, a friend from a life that did not include the table, someone whose presence smelled faintly of fresh ink and city air. The guest paused at the doorway of the dining room and made a gentle comment about how beautifully everything was preserved. The daughter only smiled, that practiced kind of smile that seals a door without locking it. They didn't enter the room. They didn't speak of the table. And the guest, sensing the boundary without explanation, never returned. The cabinet held other things too. A corkscrew that hadn't touched a bottle in decades, a set of linen coasters still bound by the yellowed ribbon they'd arrived in, a handwritten recipe card for summer soup, edges curled, ink softened by time. None of it valuable in the world outside, but in here, it was treasure. Not because it was rare, but because it was untouched by everything that had come after. It was, in some strange way, pure. One day, during a particularly silent afternoon, a bird landed on the windowsill just beside the cabinet. It peered inside, tapping once at the glass before flying away. The sound startled no one, but the silence that followed felt somehow heavier, as if the cabinet itself had exhaled, or remembered, or braced. And then the light moved on, as it always did, leaving everything exactly where it had been. There was a drawer beneath the cabinet, shallow and often overlooked. It didn't hold anything precious, just the forgotten things that once belonged in the rhythm of a household. A bundle of birthday candles, mostly bent. A matchbook from a restaurant that no longer existed. A tape measure, curled like a sleeping cat. It was the drawer of almosts. Almost thrown away. Almost remembered. Almost needed. No one opened it to find anything. They opened it to feel a certain kind of quiet. Inside that drawer, tucked under a brittle envelope, was a place card. Cream-colored, hand-lettered in ink that had bled slightly over the years. It bore the name of someone who never showed up. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't. And yet the card was written, placed, and saved. The name stared up with patient dignity, as if still expecting a seat, still waiting for a plate that would one day be filled. Nobody dared remove it. Even those who didn't know the story could feel it, the boundary between what had happened and what was hoped for. In another corner of the drawer, there was a photograph. Not framed, not displayed. Just loose, with creases running through the middle where it had been folded and unfolded too many times. It showed a meal once shared in a different house, long before the table was inherited, before silence became a member of the family. Everyone in the picture was looking somewhere else, toward each other, toward food, toward something outside the frame. No one was looking at the camera, which made the image feel truer somehow, as if it had captured not a pose, but a moment that didn't know it was being held. The drawer would sometimes stick when pulled, You had to tug gently, then wait for it to give. And when it did, there was always that faint scent. Wood, old paper, and something sweeter, like orange peel or cinnamon, long since gone but still echoing. A scent that reminded you that this house had once been warm, that drawers had once been opened not for memory, but for use. Upstairs, in a closet rarely opened, there was a tablecloth folded with ceremonial care. Ivory linen, embroidered along the edges with a pattern no one had ever named, but everyone recognized. It had been meant for special occasions, the kind that required ironing the day before and laying it out with both reverence and caution. It had only been used once. That was the strange thing. Just once. And then it was folded, placed away, and left in the hush of mothballs and cedar blocks, as if even that single use had been too much or too soon. No one knew exactly why it had never returned to the table. Some said it had been stained, though the fabric bore no trace. Others believed it had simply become too beautiful, too delicate to bear the weight of everyday lives. It became a symbol of something not yet lived, not fully earned. To bring it down would be to declare that the waiting was over. And no one in the house had ever felt brave enough or foolish enough to do that. Years passed. The closet held its breath. And every once in a while, someone would go up there, not to retrieve the tablecloth, but to look at it, unfolding it just slightly, letting their fingers run along the stitched border, tracing the lines without purpose. It felt like opening a door to a room that had never been entered, full of dustless air and unopened windows, the kind of room that lives only in blueprints, not in memory. Back in the dining room, the bare table waited without complaint. It did not ask for linen, for silver, for flowers. It simply was. And perhaps that was its power, that in a house filled with past tense and unfinished gestures, the table remained a present thing, not dressed for hope, not wrapped in regret, just wood, smooth in the places where hands had once rested, still strong beneath the weight of silence. There was a season, late autumn maybe, when the idea of clearing the table was quietly raised. Not out loud, but in gestures. A cloth brought halfway in from the laundry room, a glance that lingered on the cooling roast before drifting elsewhere. Even a moment when a hand hovered just inches above a plate, unsure whether to lift it or simply acknowledge its weight. But nothing happened. The gestures dissolved as they always did, into the quiet current that ran beneath the house, a current that carried intentions away before they became decisions. One morning, a soft breeze moved through the open window. A rare thing. The curtains lifted slightly, brushing against the legs of a nearby chair, and a single napkin, creased and untouched, fluttered to the floor. It didn't land with drama. It simply settled. But the shift was enough to make someone look. And in that glance was something close to tenderness. Not sorrow, not longing. Just the recognition that even silence, when undisturbed too long, begins to fray. That day, someone poured a cup of tea in the kitchen and walked to the edge of the dining room. They didn't step in. They didn't place the cup down, but they stood long enough for the steam to cross the threshold. A thin line of warmth entering a space where nothing had breathed for years. The table didn't respond, of course, but for a moment it seemed as if the light grew softer. Or perhaps it was simply the way presence alters a room, even if the presence stays on the outside. Later that night, the cup was still in the kitchen, cold, untouched, but still full. And the napkin remained on the floor, as though no one knew what to do with a piece of ceremony that had forgotten its script. The table continued its waiting, not with urgency, but with the quiet confidence of something that had already endured far more time than anyone remembered offering. In the middle of the night, when the house had settled into its softest silence, the table almost disappeared. Not literally, of course, but the darkness blurred its edges, and without the shapes of food or people, it seemed to dissolve into the stillness around it. The only things that remained were the faint outlines of plates catching moonlight, and the quiet presence of chairs that had memorized backs that no longer rested there. In that hour, the table didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like a breath that never finished. Elsewhere in the house, Sleep was uneven. A door creaked slowly open, then closed again. Footsteps crossed carpet, then retreated. Not because of fear, but because there was nowhere left to go that didn't feel like memory. And memory, as it turns out, can be heavier than furniture. It takes up space, demands caution, and waits to be acknowledged. In a hallway mirror, someone saw their reflection in passing and didn't stop. Not out of indifference, but because some faces are best left in motion. By dawn, the table looked the same as it always had, but the light fell differently. It wasn't warmer or brighter, just less hesitant. It moved across the roast plate, lingered on the empty glass, paused at the chair pushed slightly further back than the others, and for the first time in what felt like years, someone placed something new at the edge of the table. A folded paper crane made from the corner of an old newspaper. No explanation, no ceremony. Just a quiet interruption in a room that had forgotten how to be interrupted. No one touched it, but no one removed it either. And somehow, its presence made the table feel less like a monument and more like a beginning. A small gesture in the language of returning. Not to the way things were, but to the idea that not everything lost has to stay gone. The table remained, still full, still silent, but now, just slightly, no longer alone. There was a time before the silence, though no one spoke of it directly. Not because they had forgotten, but because the memories had settled into places where words couldn't reach. They lived instead in gestures, how a drawer was opened softly, how a hand lingered on the edge of a chair, how a sigh escaped before anyone knew they were holding one. The house had once been full of rhythm. Not music exactly, but the sound of living. The knock of heels on hardwood, the clink of breakfast spoons, the brief hum of someone thinking while setting the table for dinner. The table had not always been a shrine. It had once held paper grocery bags, school books left open during hurried meals, elbows, crumbs, complaints, stories, secrets. It had absorbed spilled milk and apologies, held birthday candles that refused to blow out, and bore the weight of arms crossed in anger and then unfolded in forgiveness. Each scratch on its surface told the story of a night lived too fully to worry about polish. Each stain was a memory not washed away, but woven in. There had been laughter too, the kind that echoed even after the mouths had closed. Laughter that came between bites, interrupted stories, caused someone to lean back so hard their chair nearly tipped. Someone had always made a joke too sharp, and someone else always responded too late. That too had been a kind of ritual, one not written down, but understood in the shared glances passed between those who had grown used to each other's shadows and silences alike. In those days, meals began without announcement. People drifted in, not at once but in orbit, pulled toward the table like planets around a soft gravity. No one waited for everyone to arrive before starting, but everyone somehow arrived before it ended. And though no one ever said it out loud, that table had been the center of something fragile and enormous. The kind of center you only notice once it's gone. The photographs told part of the story, but only the parts they could capture in stillness. Smiling faces, tilted heads, raised glasses. Always the performance of togetherness, paused in time before the next joke fell flat, before someone left the table early, before someone didn't come back. They hung on the hallway walls, slightly crooked from years of quiet shifting, each frame a door that led not backward but sideways, into fragments, into flickers. One photo showed the table at its most alive, a celebration, perhaps a birthday, or just the kind of evening when joy arrived without occasion. Plates half full, a hand blurred in motion, someone mid-laugh with their eyes almost closed. The image had a softness to it, as if even the camera knew that it was trying to hold something that wouldn't last. No one had taken it down, even when the people in it became strangers to the house. Even when one of them stopped being alive and the others stopped acting like they were still family. Memory didn't fade so much as it became quieter. What once stood bright in the mind now settled like dust in the corners, felt more than seen, present, more than precise. The table became a translation of those memories, not their keeper, but their echo, a place that remembered without needing to recall. No one asked it to, but it did anyway. not out of loyalty, but out of the simple truth that things which remain untouched for long enough begin to store meaning whether they want to or not. There was an old salt shaker with a chipped edge and a habit of jamming. It hadn't been used in years, but no one threw it out. It stood like a little sentinel at the far end of the table, forgotten and irreplaceable. Not because of its function, but because once, long ago, someone had knocked it over in a fit of laughter, and everyone else had laughed harder because of it. That moment had no photograph, but the salt shaker was enough. There were places on the table where the wood had worn smooth from touch, edges where hands used to drum absent-mindedly, corners where elbows once rested during long conversations that never quite ended. These spots bore no decoration, no embellishment, just the quiet imprint of use, a kind of erosion that spoke of presence without needing names or dates. If you ran your fingers along them, you might feel a warmth that didn't belong to the present moment, but to every moment that had layered itself there, silently, year after year. One chair had a slight tilt to it, a wobble that no one had ever bothered to fix. It had been a source of mild complaint, occasional humor, and eventually quiet acceptance. It was always offered last, the chair for the person who arrived late or didn't mind shifting weight now and then. And when that person stopped coming, the chair stayed empty. Not because anyone declared it so, but because its absence had already learned how to sit there. The chair didn't creak anymore. It just waited. In the kitchen drawer, there was a cloth napkin with a name embroidered in blue thread. The stitching had loosened in places, as if even the letters had grown tired. No one used cloth napkins anymore. Paper had taken their place in the rhythm of convenience. But that one remained, folded, not with care, but with familiarity. It had belonged to someone who had once insisted on small things: the correct spoon for soup, the exact temperature of tea, the lighting dimmed just so. Those preferences had once felt particular, even frustrating. Now they felt like architecture, details that held the shape of a person after the person was gone. And in the center of the table, where the roast had once cooled and the fruit had once ripened, there was now only air. No centerpiece, no seasonal decoration, just a bare, open stretch of wood. Yet somehow, that space felt fuller than anything that could be placed on it. It held something unspeakable, not grief, not memory, not even hope. Just the hum of what had mattered. The kind of fullness that makes no sound but changes everything it touches. In the attic, stacked beneath a box of winter coats, there was a tin of old menus. Not restaurant menus, but handwritten ones. Sheets of lined paper torn from notebooks, dated in the corner with the kind of care reserved for things not meant to be forgotten. Roast lamb with rosemary, baked pears with cinnamon, potato gratin, always with extra cream. The handwriting changed over the years, sharper in youth, looser with time, but the ritual remained. Planning the meals had been as much a part of the occasion as eating them. It was where anticipation began, days before anyone gathered. No one knew why the menus were kept. They weren't beautiful. Some were stained, some smudged with oil or smears of pencil that had never been erased. But they read like small letters to a time when meals meant more than hunger. They were stories disguised as lists, proof that someone had once imagined everyone together, sharing something warm. Even the menu for the dinner that never happened was there, folded neatly, untouched, the ink still dark. It had been planned in full, starters, main course, dessert. It just never reached the table. Downstairs, the table bore no trace of that forgotten feast, but maybe that was the point. The absence didn't live in the wood, it lived in the paper, in the dish that was never cooked, the toast that was never raised. Yet still, the menu remained. A quiet refusal to let that evening disappear entirely. A fragment of a possibility still breathing beneath the lid of an old tin box. Once, someone brought the box down. They opened it by the window, let the light spill across the pages. They didn't read them aloud, didn't cry. They simply looked, long enough to feel something stir, then closed the lid again, gently, like tucking in a child who had outgrown lullabies. The box was returned to the attic, not out of dismissal, but because some things belong where silence is thickest. Some memories are too tender to live in plain sight. There was a particular time of day, just after the sun slipped below the trees, but before the house turned to lamplight, when the dining room glowed with a muted amber. It was a brief window, only a few minutes long, when everything looked softer, almost like a memory of itself. The table, bathed in that light, appeared less like an artifact and more like a question, not of what had happened, but of what might still be possible. In that fragile hour, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt suspended, like the air was listening. Someone once tried to play music in the room again. A small speaker was placed quietly on the windowsill, a record of old piano pieces chosen not for nostalgia, but for their lack of words. The notes drifted into the space carefully, brushing against the edges of chairs, curling beneath the chandelier. It lasted only 2 tracks. Then, as if realizing it had overstayed, the music stopped. Not turned off, just faded out, and no one mentioned it. But for days after, the room felt slightly altered, as if it had exhaled something it had been holding too long. The fireplace at the end of the room hadn't been used in years, but a single log still sat there, half-charred, left over from the last time warmth had been more than metaphor. The hearth was cold now, but clean. No ash, no soot, just memory nestled in brick. The poker still leaned beside it, untouched, waiting not for fire, but for intention. And though no one planned to use it again, no one moved it either, as if to say, the tools remain, should the need for heat return. Sometimes at night, the room reflected itself in the glass of the window, an echo of chairs and plates and silence floating in the darkness outside. From the garden, if you stood in just the right place, you could see both the real table and its reflection, one lit by a quiet bulb overhead, the other by nothing at all. And in that double image there was something almost sacred. 2 tables, both full, neither eaten from. A symmetry of stillness. One day, without announcement or occasion, someone placed a candle at the center of the table. It wasn't ornate. Just a plain white taper in a simple brass holder, slightly tarnished at the base. No one lit it. No one said why it was there. But from that moment on, the table seemed to lean into it. Not literally, but atmospherically. The candle became a kind of quiet punctuation in a sentence that hadn't ended. Not hope, not mourning, just presence. That evening, the light caught the brass and cast a soft reflection onto the wood. Not bright, just enough to remind the room it had edges. The plates glowed faintly, the glasses shimmered. It was as if the objects themselves had turned slightly to face the flame, but still no one sat. The candle remained unburnt, a possibility held in wax. Later that week, the candle disappeared. No one remembered moving it. No one asked. But the space it left behind felt deliberate, like a footstep erased from snow but still remembered by the shape of its indent. The table didn't seem emptier. If anything, it seemed more complete, as if the act of placing and removing the candle had completed something unfinished, not loudly, but sufficiently. In the days that followed, the air in the dining room shifted, not in temperature, not in scent, just in feeling. Chairs still stood, plates remained untouched, but something had softened. The silence was no longer heavy. It had become tender, like the hush in a chapel after the last hymn, or the stillness of a theater when the curtain has closed and no one has stood up yet. A silence that honored rather than denied. And then one morning, the sun reached the table in full for the first time in years. Not through a half-closed curtain or filtered through dust, but directly, fully, unapologetically. It lit every plate, every glass, every worn corner of wood. And for a brief moment the table looked new. Not because it had changed, but because someone, somewhere, had allowed it to be seen differently. Beneath the floorboards, directly under the table, was a hollow space in the foundation, just wide enough for sound to settle, just deep enough for footsteps to echo faintly before fading. No one had built it with intention. It had formed over time, as houses do, through the natural shifting of soil and the slow yield of age. But it gave the dining room a certain acoustics, a soft resonance that made even silence feel like it had depth. Every movement in the room, no matter how slight, carried with it a sense of being heard. There had once been laughter in that space, trapped between footsteps and stories, sealed into the grain of the wood like pollen in amber. You couldn't hear it now, not directly. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the floor would creak in a way that sounded familiar. Not unsettling, not ghostly, just remembered. Like a giggle that had traveled too far from its source but still knew where it belonged. Over the years, rugs had been placed and removed, chairs shifted and returned, but the table had never moved, not even an inch. It was as if the house had built itself around it, not the other way around. The idea of lifting it, of displacing it even temporarily, felt wrong, as though something essential would be disturbed, and not just physically. The weight of the table was not in its mass, but in its memory. And memory, when settled long enough, becomes a kind of architecture. Near one of the table's legs, carved low where only a child might notice, were 3 small initials, faded, shallow, nearly erased by time and polish. No one knew who had carved them, though everyone had a theory. Some believed it was the youngest son, who had once hidden under the table during a thunderstorm, clutching a toy with both hands as if it were an anchor. Others thought it might have been the mother, long before she became the one who worried in silence. But the truth didn't matter. The initials remained, not defiant, not decorative, just there. A quiet mark of someone saying, "I was here." There was a cupboard near the entryway that no one opened unless they had to. It held placemats with frayed edges, napkin rings that had once been polished to a gleam, and a stack of serving spoons, their handles dulled by time. Inside, a faint scent lingered. Lemongrass, maybe, or something once used to keep moths away. The cupboard had not changed in years. Even the way the towels were folded seemed preserved, as if waiting for the same hands that had put them there to return and use them again, exactly as before. On the top shelf, behind a tin box of buttons and a cracked measuring cup, there was a folded paper, a seating chart for a dinner that never happened. Names were written in different inks, some added in haste, others crossed out with hesitation. A note beside one of the chairs read, "Ask if she's still coming." No one ever did. The paper remained, aging in silence, the ink bleeding softly into the fibers. It was not forgotten. It had simply become part of the furniture. Like an old hope, politely waiting its turn to be called upon, long after the room had emptied. One evening, someone opened the cupboard, not to retrieve anything, but because they couldn't remember what was in it. They stood with the door open, hand resting on the frame, eyes scanning the contents with the vague disorientation that comes not from unfamiliarity, but from remembering too much at once. They didn't reach in, they didn't speak, but their breath caught slightly when they saw the seating chart, still there, folded neatly, waiting. After a moment, they closed the door again, not out of denial, but because some memories are best preserved by not touching them. The cupboard clicked shut, softly, and the sound it made rippled through the room like a sigh. Not sad, not heavy, just present. The kind of sound a house makes when it realizes someone still knows where everything is kept. There was a plant that had once stood by the window near the table, a tall, leafy thing in a ceramic pot, slightly too large for the space but proudly kept anyway. It had been brought home years ago, a gift from someone who didn't stay, but whose absence left less trace than the plant's quiet persistence. For a time, it had thrived there, leaves brushing the glass, catching sunlight, casting playful shadows on the tablecloth below. Someone used to water it every Thursday, then every other Thursday, then not at all. Now, only the pot remained, emptied, dry, with a thin ring of mineral residue tracing where water had once evaporated. The soil had been removed, but a single root thread still clung to the bottom, as if reluctant to leave entirely. It didn't draw attention. It didn't ask for anything. It was just there, like so much else in the room, holding space for what had been alive once, and now simply wasn't. No one moved it. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of respect. From the outside, the house still looked lived in. The curtains were adjusted with the sun, the porch light turned on at dusk, the grass kept trimmed. But there were no deliveries, No laughter spilling into the yard, no chairs dragged across the floor. The sounds that made a house feel inhabited had faded into the slow rhythm of maintenance, a kind of quiet that wasn't empty, just careful, as if the house itself had become afraid of too much noise. Inside, the table stood beneath the chandelier like always. Shadows stretched longer now, softer. Dust moved only when someone passed through. But on one afternoon, without reason, without meaning, a single leaf floated down from somewhere above and landed on one of the plates. No breeze had carried it. No tree grew close enough. Yet there it was, pale, weightless, resting in the very center of the dish as if invited. No one removed it. There was a drawer beneath the hutch that hadn't been opened in years, not because it was forgotten, but because everyone knew exactly what was inside. A collection of table linens, carefully folded and stacked, each with its own small story stitched invisibly between the threads. The red-checked cloth that had once been used during summer lunches on the back porch. The ivory runner embroidered with wheat stalks, brought out only in autumn, always accompanied by cinnamon and clove. And a pale green one with a faint wine stain in one corner, a stain that had never come out despite effort, despite hope. The linens no longer carried the scent of lavender sachets or laundry sun-dried on a line. Now they smelled only of age, of fabric holding breath. Yet when the drawer was finally opened, the folds still held their shape. Corners crisp, edges straight, as if the hands that last touched them had passed on not just touch, but memory. And though those hands had long since grown still, their care remained, pressed gently into cotton and linen, into creases that had outlived purpose. That day, someone sat on the floor before the open drawer. They didn't reach for anything, only stared for a long while, as if reading the invisible text written between the layers. You could see it in their posture. Not grief, not longing, but a kind of quiet reverence. As though they weren't looking at linens, but at a landscape. A field of small domestic rituals stretching across time. A map of where togetherness had once unfolded, stain by stain, fold by fold. The drawer was closed slowly, almost ceremonially, and the room returned to stillness. But something had shifted. The table, though untouched, seemed to listen more closely. The plates, unchanged, felt a shade less idle. As if the simple act of seeing, of remembering without rearranging, had been enough to stir the silence into something gentler, not lighter, just more awake. In the narrow hallway leading from the kitchen to the dining room, there hung a small, round mirror, the kind once used for quick glances and last-minute adjustments before guests arrived. Its frame was simple wood, worn smooth by years of fingertips brushing past. The glass had dulled slightly with time, not enough to distort, but enough to soften every reflection it held. When the house was full, the mirror caught fleeting images, hands carrying dishes, shoulders brushing by, the flicker of a smile escaping from one room to another. Now it mostly reflected stillness, or the occasional shaft of light moving across the floor. Sometimes it caught a face, briefly, unintentionally, as someone passed through without realizing they'd looked at themselves. The reflection was never full, never centered, just an eye or a cheekbone or a shadow of hair. And in that glimpse there was always something distant, not absent, just paused, as though the person they saw in the mirror hadn't quite caught up to who they were now. A small crack had begun to form in the corner of the glass. It wasn't new, but it hadn't always been there. No one remembered when it appeared. One day the mirror had simply changed, the way quiet things do, without announcement, without cause. It didn't shatter. It didn't demand attention. It just carried the crack like a wrinkle of memory, a line between past and present that refused to be polished away. One evening, the sun hit the mirror at just the right angle and cast a perfect circle of light onto the table. Not large, not dramatic, just a glowing ring, soft-edged and golden, resting beside an untouched spoon. It stayed there for less than a minute, but in that minute, the table looked illuminated from within, as if something sacred had been acknowledged without anyone needing to say a word. No one saw it happen, but the mirror did. In the corner of the dining room, just behind the last chair, there stood an umbrella stand. Empty. Always. It hadn't held an umbrella in decades. No one remembered putting it there, and no one thought to move it. It became part of the room's architecture. A piece of furniture that served no purpose but stood anyway, as if guarding something that couldn't be named. Occasionally, someone would brush past it and glance down, expecting to find a forgotten cane or a folded newspaper. But it always held nothing. Just space. That emptiness, however, wasn't vacant. It was filled with all the departures that had never been properly acknowledged. The quick exits after an argument. The silent slipping away of someone who couldn't bear one more holiday. The gradual drift of people who once belonged but now only existed in anecdotes. The umbrella stand held those absences better than the table ever could, not because it was strong, but because it was overlooked. And some memories prefer corners to centerpieces. The room had a way of holding on to things long after their purpose faded, not through intention, but through inertia. A vase that had once held spring flowers now sat dry, its surface etched with faint water rings that no polish could remove. A drawer still contained a roll of birthday streamers, creased from years of compression. Even the dust that gathered on the molding did so gently, like it knew the house no longer welcomed sudden change. And yet, despite all this, the room never felt abandoned. It felt paused, like a book left open on a table, its spine relaxed, its pages waiting for the reader to return, not urgently, not desperately, just patiently. The table in its silence had learned the art of stillness without emptiness. It no longer asked to be filled. It had become something else entirely, a place that remembered not what was served, but who had once sat there, even briefly, even imperfectly. As night came, the last of the light slipped behind the hills, and the dining room dimmed into its usual hush. The plates caught a final glint before surrendering to shadow. The chairs, in their familiar arrangement, cast long silhouettes that blurred into each other. And in the quiet, the umbrella stand stood motionless, empty as always, but never without meaning. The ceiling above the dining table had once been painted a soft cream, warm enough to catch candlelight, subtle enough not to draw the eye. Over time, the color had faded into something paler, closer to the quiet gray of early morning. It hadn't cracked, but the brushstrokes were beginning to show, gentle arcs from hands long gone, wrists that had once moved with purpose, dipping, reaching, finishing what they'd started without knowing how long it would last. No one looked up often, but when they did, they saw not neglect, but touch, human, imperfect, lasting. There was a small hook in the center of the ceiling. It had once held a garland of paper stars for a child's birthday, later a sprig of mistletoe during winters when joy needed help entering the room. Now it held nothing, but it remained, a tiny anchor to all the moments that had gathered beneath it, a marker of celebration, of expectation, of someone once believing the space above a table could hold magic. And though bare, the hook still caught light, every morning briefly, when the sun crept in at the perfect angle. The chandelier, too, had aged. Its crystals no longer sparkled the way they used to, dulled not by dust, but by time itself. A few of the hanging pieces had turned slightly, their angles skewed from perfect symmetry. One hung a fraction lower than the others, a small imperfection that no one fixed, perhaps because it had become familiar. Like a face you love not despite its lines, but because of them. The chandelier no longer commanded attention. It simply existed above the table like a silent witness, having watched every meal, every absence, every near return. Beneath it, the table still reflected the light, but not brightly. It received it the way old wood does, with a softness that speaks of patience. The grain, worn and silken at the edges, bore no decoration, no centerpiece, no linen to distract from what it was. A surface that had learned the shape of waiting. Not passive, not empty, but alert in its stillness. The kind of surface that absorbs without taking, that offers without demanding, that remembers without needing to explain. There was a step between the kitchen and the dining room, Just one, barely a rise, but always enough to feel. It had creaked for as long as anyone could remember, a soft groan underfoot that once announced arrivals and departures with a kind of gentle honesty. Now it creaked less, not because it had been fixed, but because fewer feet passed over it. The wood had settled into stillness, as if learning that anticipation could be quiet, as if the sound of someone coming wasn't something to expect anymore, but something to remember. At the edge of that step sat a scuff mark, darkened by time, worn into the corner where shoes used to catch. It hadn't been intentional. No one ever paused there on purpose. But over years of small hesitations, of stopping briefly to carry something, or to catch a thought before walking in, it had deepened. A shadow pressed into the wood by indecision. And though no one mentioned it, everyone who crossed that threshold adjusted their step, as if stepping around a memory that had never been named. One afternoon, a plate was brought into the room, not placed on the table, just carried through. Its presence felt strange, not because it was unusual to carry a plate, but because it had been so long. The person holding it paused at the threshold, looked down at the table, then at the chair nearest the window. It had always been that chair, the one for the guest who never knocked, who brought a bottle of wine and stories that made the room feel fuller. But the plate didn't reach it. The person stood for a moment longer, then turned and left, leaving the room untouched, the step creaking once behind them. The air settled again, not heavier, just slower. The room returned to its balance, the quiet architecture of almosts. And though nothing had changed, the table now carried a new layer. Not grief, not longing, just the faint impression of a plate that almost arrived. Behind the door to the dining room, hidden from sight unless you closed it fully, was a small pencil mark on the wall. Faint, barely visible in the low light, it had once measured the height of a growing child. Next to it, in uneven handwriting, was a date, years old, written with quiet pride. The mark hadn't been added to since, not because the child stopped growing, but because the ritual had ended. Time had moved forward, but the wall held still, preserving the height, the moment, the pause between measurement and celebration. It was not forgotten. It was simply enough. The door itself rarely closed now. It remained ajar, not out of neglect, but out of instinct, as if the room behind it needed air, or as if the silence preferred not to be sealed in. When it did close, it did so slowly, dragging gently across the floor with a whisper like fabric brushing wood. And behind it, the mark remained, still waiting. Not for comparison, not for continuation, but to be noticed again by someone who remembered why it was made. There was a time when footsteps would echo through that doorway, each one purposeful, confident, loud with intention. People carrying trays, voices rising and falling like tide. Now the sounds in the room were smaller, the tick of the clock, the stretch of old wood, the soft sigh of fabric shifting on a forgotten chair, and once in a while the echo of laughter, not present, not imagined, but remembered by the room itself, as if it had soaked into the walls and returned only when no one was listening. At dusk, shadows lengthened across the floor, and the pencil mark disappeared into dimness. But it was still there. The house remembered what it had marked. The table remembered who had once needed help reaching it. And the room, in its quiet persistence, held onto that memory not with sorrow, but with gentleness. Because some records aren't meant to be updated, only honored. Near the baseboard behind the buffet cabinet, there was a tiny chip in the plaster wall. It had started as a bump from moving furniture too quickly, then softened over time into something almost natural, like the house had blinked. No one patched it. No one even mentioned it. It was too small to fix, too familiar to erase. And yet for those who noticed, it marked a moment, one of those forgotten clashes between intention and clumsiness, when a plate had slipped, and a voice had risen, and someone had said, "It's fine," but hadn't meant it. The buffet itself had once been a hub of motion, Drawers opening with the scrape of cutlery, doors clicking shut around folded napkins and extra serving tongs. During gatherings, it was the place where people stood when they didn't want to sit, leaning casually, sipping slowly, placing half-finished glasses along its edge like punctuation marks in conversations. Now, it bore only dust, and one single water ring, perfectly circular, left by a glass no one remembered setting down. It never dried fully. Even after years, it always looked faintly damp, as if waiting to be claimed. Sometimes in the early hours before anyone stirred, the room felt different, not haunted, but aware, as though the house, in its quiet hours, did its remembering most honestly when no one was around to interfere. The dust shifted differently in the half-light. The wood creaked not with age, but with memory. The space felt not empty, but expectant, not for people, but for acknowledgement, for someone to pause, not to restore what had been, but to recognize what remained. The chip in the plaster remained unchanged, but one morning someone brushed a fingertip across it, not to fix it, just to touch it, just to feel the indentation and remember the sound that had caused it, the brief silence that followed, the way a sentence had stopped and never restarted. The house didn't react, but the room held its breath a little longer, as if that one gesture had smoothed a wrinkle across time. Nothing had been corrected, but something, quietly, had been seen. There was an old wooden box beneath the table, pushed far back, nearly hidden by the shadows of the chairs. It wasn't decorative, just functional, the kind used to store candles or coasters or things once thought useful. The lid had warped slightly from time, refusing to sit flush, leaving a narrow slit that collected dust and light in equal measure. No one remembered placing it there. It simply was, like so many things in the house, not quite lost, not quite needed. Inside, folded carefully and undisturbed, were handwritten notes. Not letters, not recipes, just fragments, a shopping list without a heading, a line of poetry copied in haste, a child's drawing of a table, oddly square, with arms instead of legs. The ink had faded into sepia, the edges curled, as if the paper itself was learning how to bow. Someone had once placed these pages aside, intending to return, to finish, to use. But the pages waited, undemanding, growing quieter each year. One corner of the box held something different, a brass key wrapped in tissue. It didn't match any lock in the house. Its presence felt more symbolic than practical, like a promise made and never fulfilled. The kind someone might keep not to use, but to remember that they once believed in opening something, that they had once been the kind of person who carried keys not for rooms, but for moments. The key was warm to the touch, even after all those years, as if it remembered fingers, even if it had forgotten doors. No one opened the box often, but its presence beneath the table gave the room a kind of quiet weight, not heaviness, but grounding, like a stone in a pocket, reminding the body of where it was, of what it carried. And once in a while, when the light dipped just right, the slit in the lid would glow gold for a moment, a flicker, a breath, a reminder that even the smallest containers could hold the most enduring things. The night sky above the house had its own rhythm, clouds moving in slow procession, stars slipping in and out of view like old thoughts returning uninvited. From the dining room window, the moon would sometimes appear in perfect symmetry above the table, casting a soft, diffused light that made the glasses glisten faintly, even when they were empty. In those moments, the room didn't feel inside or outside. It felt suspended, like a place between. There was a time when someone used to sit at the table just to watch the sky change. No meal, no company, just a cup of tea growing cool beside their hand. They never turned on the lights. The darkness felt honest. It let them see things the day had buried, the shimmer in old glass, the way the wood grain curled like a sleeping form, the reflection of the moon in a spoon left untouched. Even after they stopped coming, the room still waited for that ritual, as though the table missed being watched. One night, long after the rest of the house had gone still, a shadow moved across the window. Not startling, just present. A cat, perhaps, or the wind shifting branches, But for a moment the reflection in the glass looked almost human, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting gently on the edge of the table. And then it was gone. No one saw it, no one checked. But the room grew quieter, and the chairs seemed straighter, as if they had risen to attention. That same night, a breeze moved through the slightly cracked window and nudged the corner of a napkin. It folded in on itself, slowly, like a closing hand, then came to rest beside a spoon. Nothing else moved, but that single motion, so small and effortless, made the table look like it had just been left, like someone had stood up to stretch or stepped away for a moment, intending to return. And in that pause, the whole room seemed to breathe. The moonlight lingered a while longer, then slipped behind a cloud, taking its silver with it. The room dimmed, not into darkness, but into memory. And beneath the hush, the table remained, full of silence, full of stories, full of everything that had ever been almost said. Morning arrived the way it always did, slowly, without asking permission. The first light entered through the east window, brushing the edge of the table like a fingertip across an old photograph. It didn't reveal anything new. It simply reminded the room that it was still there. The plates caught the light but gave nothing back. The glasses remained translucent, silent. And the chairs, steady in their arrangement, faced forward like listeners who had heard everything once and were still waiting for the part that made it make sense. The air held a softness that wasn't always there. It moved through the room without stirring dust, like someone walking barefoot through memory. The walls, once so practiced in their stillness, seemed almost to lean in, not physically, but atmospherically, as though the house had grown tired of keeping its distance from the story unfolding inside it. Even the floor, long settled into its creaks and hesitations, felt different, quieter somehow, less a surface than a skin. Someone entered the room, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a shape passing through light, a presence that felt both new and familiar. They didn't carry anything. Their hands were empty. Their eyes did not search. They moved with the careful grace of someone not trying to disturb, yet aware that their very presence already had. They stood at the edge of the table and looked at it, not nostalgically, not regretfully, but the way one looks at an old tree, still growing, still rooted, still bearing weight without complaint. They reached for the back of a chair and touched it lightly, not to pull it out, not to sit, just to feel it, to remember its shape, to acknowledge what it had held. Their fingers traced the top rail once, then let go. And in that letting go, something subtle changed. The light grew warmer. The silence grew rounder. It was as if the house had exhaled after holding a breath for too long, and in doing so, had allowed the table to rest, not because its purpose was over, but because its waiting had been seen. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves in the garden, and for the first time in years, one blew gently against the window pane. It made no sound, but it left a mark. The mark on the window faded as the sun climbed, but for a moment, it had caught the shape of the room from outside, its outline blurred, its contents hinted at through layers of glass and reflection. From the garden, the table looked serene, almost fictional, like something imagined by someone who missed it without ever having sat there. The chairs formed a gentle constellation, the plates catching faint highlights like distant stars. It was the kind of image that made people stop without knowing why, then move on, quietly altered. Inside, the table remained untouched, but its stillness no longer felt expectant. It felt inhabited, not by bodies, but by the full weight of presence. There was no grand event, no whispered resolution, just the recognition that a space could be sacred without ceremony. That meaning could be shaped not by what occurred, but by what endured. And the table had endured, through birthdays uncelebrated, meals unserved, conversations left hanging in doorways. It had borne the gravity of silence without collapse. In the far corner, light fell across the old brass key, still resting in its tissue, still warm in a way that defied explanation. It had never found a lock. Perhaps it never would, but its meaning had outgrown its function long ago. Now it lay there like punctuation, neither a beginning nor an end, but a pause deep enough to carry everything in between. No one reached for it, but it was enough to know it was there. Some things are not meant to be used, only held. Later that day, the house creaked in the heat. Floorboards expanded and settled with the rhythm of age. The cupboard door opened slightly of its own accord, then fell closed again, gently, like a sigh returning to where it began. A napkin shifted on the table, unprovoked, curling at one corner. It didn't fall. It simply changed shape. And in that quiet, in that barely noticeable drift of fabric and air, the room whispered what it had waited so long to say. Not everything forgotten is lost. Not everything silent is empty. That evening, the dining room settled into its familiar dusk, the kind that did not announce itself but simply arrived, pressing shadows into corners, softening edges, turning the table into a silhouette against the last of the light. No lamps were turned on. The room didn't need them. It glowed in the way quiet things do, dim, deliberate, and full of unspoken presence. The chairs cast long reflections on the floorboards, like memories walking backward toward the door. Somewhere in the house, a drawer closed. A clock ticked without urgency. The world continued as it always had, and yet something beneath the rhythm had changed. The table didn't look newer or older, but it felt clearer, as if the silence around it had finally settled into clarity, as if the waiting had become witnessing. It no longer seemed like a place for something to happen, but a place where something already had, and was still echoing, gently, without end. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cut grass and distant rain. It slipped through the tiniest seams in the window, curling beneath the chandelier, wrapping itself briefly around the legs of the chairs. For a moment, the entire room breathed. Not metaphorically, but truly. Walls expanding in silence, the table exhaling years of held breath, the air carrying traces of everything unsaid but never gone. If rooms had lungs, this was the sound of release. And then came stillness. Not the stillness of absence, but of completion. A kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be broken. The plates no longer looked expectant, they looked satisfied. The glasses didn't wait to be filled. They simply caught what light remained. The table, in its final form, had become what it was always meant to be. Not a stage, not a symbol, not even a memory, but a presence, a truth, a single unmoving witness to lives that had passed across it like seasons. And like the earth beneath a long-forgotten path, it had learned to remember without holding on. By nightfall, the stars returned, scattered across the sky with the same indifferent grace they'd always had. But something in their arrangement felt different, as if they too had shifted slightly, aligning themselves not to guide travelers, but to honor what had stood still. From the window, they shimmered faintly against the glass, their light barely reaching the floor, but enough to cast a whisper of reflection across the table's edge. It was not illumination. It was acknowledgement. Inside, the darkness was soft, not empty, but enveloping. The chairs faded into it, their outlines barely visible, yet completely known. The table, though unseen in detail, felt more present than ever, like a heartbeat beneath layers of sleep. The kind of presence that doesn't ask to be noticed but is always felt. If someone had walked in at that hour, they might have paused without knowing why, sensing something sacred in the arrangement. Not because of what was there, but because of what had never been moved. In the far cabinet, the glass on the doors reflected only blackness. But within that blackness were countless outlines, shadows of plates never used, spoons that had never clinked against porcelain, napkins still folded in expectation. And yet, none of it felt tragic. It felt preserved, like a time capsule not for history, but for emotion. A quiet, steady holding of moments that had been planned, imagined, nearly lived. The kind of moments that leave behind warmth even when they never happen. And in that warmth, something stirred, not an object, not a sound, but a sense, a final softening, a loosening of the room's invisible grip, the kind of release that comes when something once held tightly no longer needs to be protected. as if the table had been guarding a story all these years, waiting for it to be understood without being spoken. And now, it was. Not by a person, not by a gesture, but by the house itself. The silence no longer shielded anything. It simply was. At dawn, the light returned gently, as if it, too, had learned to walk quietly through the house. It crept across the floor with reverence, brushing the legs of the chairs, sliding along the table's length like a hand that no longer needed to hold anything. The room welcomed it without resistance. Nothing stirred, nothing rose. But everything seemed to open just slightly, as if the wood, the glass, the very air had softened overnight. The dining room, once a place of waiting, had settled into a place of knowing. There was no final gesture. No one came in to say goodbye. The plates remained as they were. The chairs stood in the same silent posture. The box beneath the table stayed closed. But in that quiet, the house itself exhaled. Not loudly. Just enough to loosen something long held in the corners, in the seams, in the breath between days. The light caught a glint in the chandelier, then moved on, leaving a faint shimmer behind, like the last line of a letter written in a hand only the house could read. The table, unchanged, now held no expectation. It no longer waited for a meal, a gathering, a return. It had become what memory becomes after enough time has passed. Not sharper, not clearer, but softer, woven into the rhythm of presence. It didn't demand to be remembered. It simply existed as proof that something had once mattered deeply enough to endure in stillness, that a story, even one never spoken aloud, could live fully in wood and dust and light. And so the table stayed, not forgotten, not frozen, but folded into the architecture of a life quietly honored, a truth no longer urgent to be told, but content to be held. And as the sun lifted higher and filled the room with a gentle, forgiving glow, the dining room seemed to vanish, not into absence, but into peace. There was nothing left to say. And yet, even in peace, the house listened. It didn't wait. Not anymore. But it remembered how. Its walls still held the softness of unspoken invitations, and the windows still framed a view that hadn't changed, though those who once admired it had. The silence, once tight as thread stretched too long, had loosened into something tender. Not empty, not ending, just quiet. A quiet that made room for breath. The table, in its stillness, had become something beyond furniture. It was no longer defined by its absence of use, but by its fullness of meaning. A surface that had not been cleared because nothing had needed clearing. A space that had not been filled because it already held everything. Joy, hesitation, memory, loss, each layered into its grain like rings in a tree. No one could read them by touch, but they were there, written in time rather than ink. And when the evening came again, gentle and familiar, the house did not brace. The shadows slipped in like old friends who no longer needed permission. The floor did not creak. The napkin did not shift. Nothing moved. But the room glowed faintly, even in the dark. It was the kind of glow that doesn't come from light, but from understanding. A glow that only appears when something long unspoken has been heard. Completely, quietly, finally. Outside, the garden rustled with the wind as it always had. The stars returned, unremarkable, unchanged, and the house remained standing, as houses do. The chairs remained empty, the plates untouched, the key in its tissue, the mark on the wall. Nothing was resolved, nothing was restored, but everything had been seen, fully, gently, without need for repair. And in that, the table found its rest, not in being remembered, but in no longer needing to be.